Wow, look at this. Amory, look at that. 35 years of helping to build a vision of a clean, prosperous, and secure low-carbon future. When you do that, you build friends and allies, and they're assembled here in this room, and some who couldn't be here are probably watching over that camera. Thank you all so much for coming this evening and celebrating 35 years of RMI with us. What you do often when there's a birthday is you think back of all the great stuff that has happened in the last year or maybe even last 35 years. And we could do that. But the work we are doing doesn't allow us to look over our shoulders. It requires us to look into the future, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, with conviction that yes, we can. With the idea that there is an energy future that allows the next generation to live sustainable lives on this planet. And I'm not going to talk very long because there are two people here on the stage who can inspire you much more about that future than I can. As the CEO of Rocky Mountain Institute, it has been the privilege for me over the last 4 years to get to know the history of RMI, but particularly to get bought into, to feel completely passionate about the future that we see, and who better than our two speakers this evening to tell you about that. Amory, our founding father, has touched so many people over the course of his 35, 40, 45 years in this space. It's really one of the remarkable things of my job. I walk around and then people tap me on the back and say, "You work with Amory?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Oh, wow, Amory came to give this lecture at my college. Amory inspired me at this class in college. I read Amory's book and it changed my life." And so many of us have had that feeling in the past. And this morning I said about Tom that in our household, the race is who can first read Tom's column and send out to the rest of the family the annotated version with our opinions. Between the two of them, I am sure we're going to have an incredibly inspired conversation about the next 35 years of RMI and the future of our energy system and this planet. Tom Friedman, Amory Lovins. Thank you.
Jules, thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to those who are here for the 25th, where Amory and I got to do this. So it's 10 years later, and RMI is only thriving that much more. We had a great conversation today. Too bad you missed it. Should we tell them about it, Amory? Because we had a series of panels for those of you who didn't get to be here, and we really covered the waterfront. And I thought I'd begin, Amory, by asking you, what was your biggest takeaway from today? What did you learn? What did you think were the most important points that were made during the panels?
And if I have a minute to spare, tell you all I know?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I was struck by Tim Worth's eloquent point about population and how several billion fewer people would make a lot of problems much more tractable, and how that is within our grasp if we actually do something about providing family planning to the women and families that want it. I was struck by the rich diversity of approaches to our politics and the importance of focusing, as we do at RMI, on outcomes, not motives. I was giving a talk a couple of years ago about energy disruption to Club 20, which is the extractive industries consortium here on the Western Slope. And as I was leaving, I thought it had gone reasonably well. A man came running up to me and said, "May I ask you a question?" "Yes, sir." And he says, "I'm a lifelong conservative Republican. I think climate change is a hoax and Al Gore is a fraud. But let me see if I got this right. I thought I heard you say we should do exactly the same things anyway, just to strengthen our national security and make money. Did I get that right? Yes, sir, exactly. So it's very important to, as Saul Alinsky taught, to talk to folks where they're at, not where you're at, to speak to their concerns in their language. And the reinventing fire that we're all doing together has all sorts of nice benefits. Some people will care about profits, jobs, competitive advantage, some about climate and environment, some about creation care, some about stronger families and communities and national security, and a lot of other issues, and equitable global development. Doesn't matter. Any one or more of those will do. So I think one lesson that came very clearly out of the day's discussion is to focus on what we can agree ought to be done for whatever reason, and don't argue about the reasons. And we also have opportunities to act from the top down, from the bottom up, from the middle out, every which way, upside down and backward. And in the peculiar system of government we have in this country, which was brilliantly designed to make major rapid change impossible in any direction, we have a lot of opportunities. If one track doesn't work, there are others in action, and you can make it work at a city or state level, if not at a federal level. I was actually interested in Miranda Ballantyne's comment. Miranda, are you here?
Miranda's still here? There she is.
Yeah. Recently Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, owning all of their energy and facilities and related activities. And Miranda told us that in the defense authorization bill that's in Congress right now, the House actually added back and more the money that had been stricken in the administration's budget for climate change and several other things, because the military understands perfectly well that climate change is a major threat multiplier and also endangers a lot of their facilities and operations. We have some distinguished military people here, Danny McGinn, who was Secretary of the Navy, Eric Rasmussen, leading Navy physician and humanitarian disaster relief doc, and I think a number of others. That is, again, a very important part of the conversation that has lapsed in this country as we have lost a lot of our civil-military connection. But I've been helping drive the military energy agenda for about 30 years, and it's just taken off beautifully. And that's a wonderful set of allies and the leaders on renewables within the federal government and often on efficiency.
Yeah, I would agree, Amory. I left this meeting quite uplifted for many of the same reasons. Hal Harvey made the point that the leading wind states in the country are all voted for Trump.
Let's see,
Texas,
the
Wyoming,
top-
Iowa, Kansas.
the top 5 or 6 wind-powered states are all red states. I think it's 84% or so of the wind farms in the country are in Republican congressional districts. And there was an interesting piece in California that something like 5 times greater likelihood that a household in California will install rooftop solar if it's Republican, not Democratic leaning, after you correct for income. That's really interesting. We need to understand that.
Governor Ritter made the point that the new head of the governor's conference this year, Republican, has made energy innovation the top priority. And so you really see the power of governors and mayors and where they're at. They don't have a choice to play politics with things. They've got to shovel the snow when it comes, and they've got to create energy when it comes. And you do get the feeling that wherever Trump wants to go with this, fortunately, I think it's too late.
Well, the market will do what it does. And very little of that depends on federal policy pronouncements. Of course, at RMI, we are rigorously apolitical and nonpartisan.
At the New York Times, we're not,
and
actually.
Yeah, but we're so
On
broad.
the editorial page.
We're so broad-minded, we invite the Times as well. Even though we are very market-oriented as well. We take market economics seriously, not literally.
Amory, one of the most interesting points that I thought you also raised this morning, of the new things that have happened, I was thinking back from 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, India was a stubborn laggard in this issue. It took the position, as I said this morning, of it just was not going to go down that route. It was its turn to pollute. And now you've got this really interesting competition between India and China over who can get greener faster and cheaper. What are the implications of that?
Well, having China in that game means that all the clean energy stuff they make gets as cheap as sneakers. And as some of you will know, let's see, where's John Kreitz? John and his team the last few years helped the leading energy institution of the Chinese government. Belongs to the National Development and Reform Commission. So we and our partners at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and Energy Foundation of China helped them understand the Chinese energy system in a way that hadn't been done before. And they figured out how to run a seven-fold bigger economy in 2050 using today's energy 7 times more productively, and how to get 13 times more GDP out of each ton of fossil carbon, all $3 trillion cheaper than business as usual. Well, our steering committee and customers for that effort happen to be the main energy authors of the 13th five-year plan, which it strongly influenced. And they are actually, I would say, ahead of schedule. Quite a few Chinese energy experts believe, at least privately, that Chinese carbon emissions may already have peaked a few years ago, and there will still be some bouncing around, but their scenario figured they could run the seven-fold bigger economy emitting 42% less carbon than in 2010. Well, that got India's attention, and they're very interested in the notion now that, gee, maybe India will go from power scarcity and blackouts to power glut even faster than China did. China's already had to suspend or cancel 200 or 300 gigawatts of power plants. India has coal plants. India has 40 odd gigawatts in the pipeline that they're starting to realize may be pre-stranded assets. So those are now looking much less likely to get finished. And what Energy Minister Piyush Goyal did, brilliantly designed, was a series of auctions. First LEDs and then renewables, much, much cheaper, manyfold cheaper in a few years. So now renewables are cheaper than coal. And the private sector and major actors from other countries, like Miwa-san's SoftBank, yes, Miwa-san is just back here, have risen to the occasion and are driving that change. And then, of course, in India, we've just had the good fortune to help the Prime Minister's, again, planning super ministry, Niti Aayog, formulate a mobility trend has now become the kind of gold standard for what India is going to do in close collaboration with very ambitious players in the private sector. So having rivalry in those directions to impress a lot of other people in the world.
Can we get the handheld mics?
And start to
No, keep it.
Oh, okay. And it'll start to spread these kinds of changes even faster. and maybe we will get China and Japan in particular to stop subsidizing and financing the export of the coal plants that they no longer can sell at home.
I want to go over a question we raised this morning. If the head of ExxonMobil invited you in tomorrow and said, Amory, what should a company like us do right now going forward? We've got a lot of technology, we've got an enormous number of scientists, we have great expertise in a lot of areas, but obviously we've got the majority of our assets in fossil fuels. What should we do?
Well, conversations like that are going on with some large oil companies that are trying to drive the deep cultural change required. That's the hard part. ExxonMobil has terrific science, technology, economists. They're operationally probably, the standard of excellence in the industry. I wouldn't say their strategy is up to that level. Mm-hmm. And we've had a few conversations about that. But the engineers there reach very similar conclusions to ours. It's often the economists that don't get it. And I think I would start by showing that executive two lovely photographs that Tony Seba at Stanford dug up, and I'd copied now out of the National Archive. One of them is a photograph looking down Fifth Avenue in Manhattan in 1900, and you have to look really hard to find the first car. Everything's horse-drawn. The next one is the same scene 13 years later, and you have to look even harder to find the last horse, and it's not at all clear there are any horses left in that picture. And in fact, we went from 8 to roughly 80% car-owning households in 10 years, 1918 to 28, 3/4 of them financed by this newfangled thing called car loans that GM and DuPont cooked up. And today, of course, solar panels just got fivefold cheaper in 8 years. Maybe I got it backwards. Anyway, much faster than the cars got cheaper. The Model T got 62% cheaper in 13 years. And 3/4 of our rooftop solar is innovatively financed. Basically now Ford's and Edison's industry are merging to gobble up Rockefeller's industry. But what those two pictures show so starkly is that the pace of such transformations when the value proposition shifts is set not by incumbents, but by insurgents who don't care at all about the incumbents' inertias, cultures, business models, or legacy assets. They just do their own thing. And in fact, as soon as the capital markets get a whiff of this disruption, if they think you're in or headed for the toaster, they don't wait for the toast to get done. They pull their capital out of the old industry and put it into the new industry. And if policy happens, as it has, for example, in the German Energiewende until a couple of years ago, to try to enable the new industry, not protect the old industry as it does in Japan, it moves that much faster, because then you have policy and business logic and other factors all converging. And if you go, as I do, to talk to groups of oil executives, you find a curious thing. They are so intently focused, especially after the price crash, on the requirement for price to exceed cost, that some of them lose sight of the other part of the business condition, that value must exceed price. So if one of those insurgents comes up with a superior value proposition and runs off with your revenues, it doesn't matter if you can profitably provide what your ex-customers are no longer buying. So it's really important to understand who your competitors are. You know the old story about the couple of guys that are up in the Arctic and they notice a large polar bear starting to run towards them, and one of the guys starts lacing on his running shoes. His buddy says, what are you doing? You can't outrun that bear. He says, I don't need to outrun the bear. So it's very important to understand who your competitors are. And a lot of people in the energy supply industries who are so supremely good at what they do haven't quite realized yet that their biggest competitor is efficiency, which is now a bigger provider of global energy services than oil. In the United States, we have cumulatively saved 30 times more energy since 75 than we've gotten from all the increase in renewables, but they get all the headlines, and they deserve a lot of headlines, but the energy you don't use is invisible. So it's really hard to see that competition. So I think I would ask the person you mentioned, why is it that your highest forecast of electric vehicle demand destruction for oil in 2030 is 9 times smaller than Bloomberg's mid-case, which looks conservative for these reasons? Are you really willing to bet your company that you've got that forecast right? Because, you know, in about 7 or 8 years, when your new frontier projects just being sanctioned or coming on stream, that's when Bloomberg says there will be 2 million barrels a day less oil demand than we thought because of electric vehicles, and that's more than it just took to unbalance the market enough to crash the oil price, just as your projects come on needing higher price. And then the conversation might get pretty interesting.
Very interesting. Well, in that same vein, Amory, you know, RMI is a strictly nonpartisan, non-political organization. So what if one of your conservative supporters came to you and said, I know Donald Trump, I would like you to go see him. What would you say to him?
Of course, we're happy to talk to anybody.
No, I know. What would you say to him?
Oh. Well,
given where you know his politics has been, his relationship with his base, how would you go about trying to move him in the right direction? What arguments would you employ?
I would probably focus on national security arguments and on making America great again by leading the next great industrial transition. And I think those both speak to the issues that he has prominently featured. And I would give examples probably exclusively from red states. You know, start with Rick Perry's presiding over the later stages of the rise of Texas to utter supremacy among all the states in wind power. It's 15% of their power. It's, I forget, 25,000 jobs. It's given them record low electricity prices, and it's helped keep the lights on when some other generators, which shall be nameless, failed in a cold snap.
I think one of the most fun demonstrations today was by our friend Bill Joy of the new battery technology that he's been working on the innovation with and bringing to market. Obviously, batteries are so central to all of this. What for you, that was the most exciting thing for me, what for you is the most exciting new thing going on out there right now?
Well, there's so many, I don't know where to start. But I think the big one is the convergence of energy and information technology and telecoms. And let me put this in a bigger context, because the energy transformation we're in the middle of, and you know, the fish doesn't know it's in the water. That's harder to see when you're in it. Is not just fundamental, it's elemental. We started with hundreds of years, or well over a millennium if you look at Chinese history, of the age of carbon. And we built our mightiest industries, our wealth, our military prowess, all of the elements of our power and success by digging up and burning each year what's now about 4 cubic miles of the rotted remains of primeval swamp goo. And we are really, really good at it. It's just incredible what these industries do for us. We are now, however, in a transition from that increasingly obsolete and uncompetitive age of carbon to the age of silicon. Silicon microchips turn people from isolated to networked, systems from dumb to smart. Silicon power electronics make electricity precisely controllable and deliverable so we can shift from fiery molecules to obedient electrons. Silicon solar cells enable the ascent of energy from mining the fires of hell. It's a pretty good theological analogy to that hot sulfurous stuff down there, to harvesting the breath and radiance of heaven. That together is an extraordinary transition, and what seems to me to be driving it faster than expected in a really exponential way is not just the energy and mobility IT mashup, it's also unexpected interactions between sectors. Bill Joy, for example, taught me that the way Apple and Samsung and so on will pay battery providers for this technology means that if I, as a battery maker, can get an extra, say, 20% battery life out of the same volume, they'll pay me so much more, my profit goes up on the order of tenfold. So I am very strongly incentivized in battery innovation. That then makes possible stuff like Tesla cars. That then builds volume, zillions of batteries stuck together in packs. And that makes the batteries cheap. The cars themselves, when they plug into the grid, can enable more graceful integration of varying solar and wind power. And the batteries also get cheap for everybody else, so you start sticking them in your house. And then when you have distributed solar everywhere, and with Bill's new battery, probably cheaper and faster than we thought. And then when that happens, you have a distressed natural gas industry. You start to face unusual new questions like, who's going to pay for the grid? Now it's probably cheaper not to have it, because now you can have solar on demand anytime, anywhere, cheaper than just running a power plant, let alone paying for the grid to get it to you. And then there are all these other ripples spreading out, and you start getting stuff like this. There's 1-point-something billion people not on the grid, and they pay, last I looked, $58 billion a year for kerosene, which kills about 4 million people a year. And if those kerosene lamps were a country, they would rank 8th in carbon emissions. And these are the poorest people in the world, paying, I believe it's 1/5 of the total cost of global lighting services to get 1/1000th of the light from very inefficient lamps. So our friends in Holland have come up with one of a number of competing technologies. It's called a waka waka, which is Swahili for shines brightly. You expose the photovoltaic side to the sun for a day, or cloudy, bright weather for 2 days, and it charges up some high temperature tolerant lithium batteries, which can then run that for 10 hours. It's very bright, or less bright for 150 hours. You finance it through the smartphone you recharge off the USB port. And this pays back in weeks to a month or two against kerosene. So for a family earning the standard $2 a day, this is like a perpetual annuity earning you a month's extra income per year. And of course, this will sit up on a Coke bottle, so it shines down on the table so your daughter can learn to read. And gee, maybe that'll help with the population issue that Tim raised. In fact, it should help a whole lot. This is part of a network of synergistic activities you can do in poor villages and farms around the world that can solve a whole lot of big problems for people everywhere, not just there.
I want one of those. Amory, I'm already put RMI 45 on my calendar. What will it be like? How will we arrive here at RMI 45? What will the room be like? What will the lights be like? What will be powered by? And what will we be talking about?
Wow. Well, these are all LEDs and daylight. LEDs every decade get 30 times more efficient, 20 times brighter, 10 times cheaper, so we may have retrofitted by then. This building produces something like 3 times the electricity it uses, and I expect it'll keep doing that. And we designed it to be a 100-year building, so I don't think it's going to be gone. How will we get here? Probably in stuff like, but more advanced than the little hypercar I've got sitting out front, carbon fiber electric, carbon fiber being paid for by needing fewer batteries, which also means it charges faster. And it will have smarter interactions with the grid. Already my charger would enable me, if the utility knew I was doing this, to pay me for the fast grid regulation that I dispatch 7 kilowatts up to the grid, so I could make a few bucks profit every night or every day recharging my car. We will have, I think, even better people working here. We're absolutely blessed with brilliant, dedicated people, but they keep getting better. And I notice our young people are better than we were at that age, so I feel the future's in good hands. What will we be talking about? Well, plus ça change. I was just looking back at a book we did for the Pentagon in '04 called Winning the Oil Endgame. And we're now ahead of schedule on what it said we could do to get off oil. And there's a section toward the back which quotes Thucydides' Peloponnesian Wars. And to paraphrase, and it's something President Kennedy said in his big speech in the Frauenkirche in Frankfurt, it's something like the Peloponnesians were mighty in battle, but greatly handicapped by their decision-making body, in which each pursued his individual self-interest and thought it was the business of somebody else to do such and such. And as each separately pursued this illusion of individual advantage, the common good imperceptibly decayed. It was not a new issue. Many democracies have dealt with what we're dealing with now. But I think we will still be in a hell of a race, and two things will have happened. The science will turn out, is already turning out, to be worse than we thought on climate change, and probably on some other issues. It's climate change not the only thing that can do us in, it's one of about 10. And I'm interested in all of those because you can't miss one. Not that RMI tries to do all of them, but stuff like nuclear proliferation and pandemic disease and so on are all important. However, as the problems get worse, the solutions get better and faster, and we get smarter at harnessing them. As a small example, which this building illustrates, and I could illustrate this for both new and retrofit office buildings, in the past 5 years, we've raised the bar more than a factor 2 on how efficient you can make an office. So this is, we think, the most efficient commercial building in the coldest or even the next coldest climate zone in North America. Good economics, nice to be in. But that wasn't through new technology. It was actually through smarter design. How do we choose and combine the technologies? And that integrative design applied to buildings, factories, equipment, vehicles, mobility systems, can often make very large, even factor 10 or so energy savings cheaper than small or no savings. So that's my next big thing in my own office as chief scientist, making that kind of integrative design common rather than rare. And yet, you would think in this technologically aware age, people would have noticed this. But, if you make pipes and ducts fat, short, and straight instead of skinny, long, and crooked, you can save about 90% of their friction. We find in the field that typically pays back in less than a year on retrofit, less than 0 in new build. It is not yet in IPCC or any other official forecast reports, studies, engineering textbooks, because it's not a technology, it's a design method. And people don't yet think of design as a scaling vector, but we do. We have a long design tradition in RMI, designing whole systems for multiple benefits, not isolated components for single benefits. So I think that's one of the revolutions that if I'm here in 10 years, I'd like to look back on and say, yeah, this is now common as grass. And that will have changed a lot. Because if we made those pipes and ducts fat, short, and straight worldwide, hypothetically, it would save about half the world's coal-fired electricity. That's a rather material omission on the good side.
We have time for maybe a couple quick questions. I don't want to deprive people here from a chance to ask whatever's on their mind. We got a microphone here, so go ahead and fire away. Somebody, I'm sure, has a question. Right there, thank you.
Thanks. So we reached an interesting tipping point in personal mobility, in the last few years, right? Where electric vehicles got like roughly on parity. I mean, maybe not quite there, but with, gasoline, maybe they're better in some ways and worse in some ways. But that was a real tipping point, right? Where all of a sudden it's not like an enthusiast thing. It's just something like you could actually go out and buy an electric car and it'll be just as good or better in some ways, What other technological tipping points do you see like that coming down the road in the next 5-10 years?
Well, buildings like this that are net energy producers, net positive, will, I think, become quite common, partly because in California, I think if I've got it right way around, all new houses starting 2020 and all new commercial buildings starting 2030 have to be net zero or better. And the industry's starting to realize, hey, 2020 is right around the corner. But there are a lot of people who've done this, and in Europe, passive buildings, many of them inspired by our banana farm up the road a third of a century ago, started off with a 10 or 20% cost premium. Now it's, for the better ones, +2 to -2%, because now you don't need to teach the designers how to do it. It's just as easy to design a great building as a bad one, if you know what you're doing. So I think buildings on the margin, the new buildings will be kind of moving out of the energy picture and becoming an energy asset. They'll also be hooked up resiliently to run with or without the grid, like our house does. Industry will be a lot more efficient and will be going for solar process heat. I think that we'll see the beginnings of a robust hydrogen economy, which now becomes very economically interesting with all that cheap night wind power and some cheap solar power. And that will run the airplanes and the heavy trucks increasingly. I'm hoping we will by then have gotten together major customer groups to bulk buy some of those super efficient, like tripled efficiency trucks and airplanes, or even more, that are already designed up to 5x airplane efficiency. So we don't screw around for a century trying to get that efficient incrementally, but we go straight to it by having a bunch of big customers say, if you meet these specs, we'll buy yay many a year at this price for this many years, start bidding. And that has worked with a lot of other things. I could think it could mobilize a lot of skill into heavy transport beyond what we've seen. The electric grid, that game's already over. A lot of details remain, but Minister Goyal in India is already saying by 2023, I believe it was, 60 to 65% of their total generating capacity in India will be renewable. They're moving that fast. China is moving so fast that in 2013, they added more solar capacity than the US had added cumulatively in the previous 59 years. 3 years later, they were going twice that fast, 3 football fields an hour of solar cells. And they'll be faster by then. So renewables will have durably taken over, and if indeed Bill Joy's batteries do what he described this morning, and I have some confidence they will, then you'll have distributed solar anywhere, and the notion of building any kind of a new fossil fueled power plant will be ridiculous. And then that, of course, raised the question, how do you relocate all that trapped equity? There are some interesting ideas emerging on how to do that, but you really want the incumbents to be either participating in the new energy business or at least gracefully exiting the old one and not just standing in the way. We already see the sheep and goats dividing in both electricity and oil. Mobility will be very IT-rich, light vehicles, electrified, competition in heavy vehicles between some electricity and a good deal of hydrogen and advanced biofuels. And I hope we will be paying farmers and ranchers by then to take carbon out of the air and stick it back in tilth where it belongs, so we're no longer treating soil like dirt, but harnessing the natural systems carbon removal that, together with the reinventing fire approach worldwide, could probably get us to 1.5 degrees and save trillions of dollars. So 10 years is the critical period. In fact, it's even a lot shorter than that to get these things into high gear, only they won't have gears. Say boost,
Time for one more.
boost phase.
One more quick one. Anybody else back there? Well, there's one right back there.
Admiral.
Amory, great job. There's a Greek proverb that says, a society becomes great when old men plant trees in whose shade they know they will never sit. Now, nobody here is old, but I just want to thank you for the tremendous tree planting that you have done over the past 35 years, and many you will continue to plant in the future.
Well, Amory, I wish I could say I planted that question. I didn't. It's such a wonderful one.
Well,
My question was going to be to close two things. One is you've been a character in my last 3 books, a very important character, and I had
even by name.
I had the pleasure of dedicating my last book to you and Hal Harvey and a group of other people who've been so important in my life and teaching me. Amory, who do you want to play you in the movie?
You.
Thank you very much.
Oh my.
Tom, Amory, please rise.
Please.
You guys deserve.
First, I got to zip up my pants. Last thing I wanted to hear was please rise.
You
Sorry.
you guys deserve a zillion awards, but the one award that I would think that all of us agree you both deserve is for inspiration. And Tom, it is much more personal than you might realize, because when I read one of your earlier books, The World is Flat, it was one of the critical parts of my personal journey to switch from business to becoming an environmentalist and helping to challenge the energy wisdom that we were then living with. We cannot thank you enough for being here yet again. We are very glad and have noted that you already have the date for the 35th, for 45th, sorry, and please let us all know because we'll show up. and I just cannot say how grateful we as an institute are for everything that you've done. A couple of weeks ago, we were in Italy, and together with some of those kids I mentioned earlier, we found this little statue, and we thought it was so symbolic for everything you stand for. It is a little world of people holding hands together.
Wow.
And if there is one message that you consistently give in everything you say, is how we are globally connected. So Tom, thank you so much for being here.
And I have the pleasure, because I've been here at RMI for 20 anniversaries. And this is by far the best, and it's because of all of you for your support and your attendance today, so thank you so much. And I'm going to tell you that when we leave for dinner, tables 1 through 9 will go out those doors, and tables 1 through 9 will go out these doors, and tables 10 through 15 will go out those doors, east, west. That's the most important thing. Now, Amory Lovins, we were talking today very briefly about what an extraordinary journey this institute has taken. And it's really because of this man and his vision. So I want to just thank Amory, and we couldn't come up with any cool gift. So what we did is memorialize today, which symbolizes 35 years, by presenting Amory with a photograph of you and Tom today. When Tom wrote on this, he said, teacher and friend. And that is indeed what I think you are to so many people. So thank you, Amory.
Thank you. And I want to say, in gratitude to Admiral McGinn, one of my friends and teachers, that there was a king who wanted to plant a tree, and the minister said to him, but sire, it will take 100 years to grow. And he said, well, then let's go out and plant it immediately.